Mokto, gracias. Thank you for allowing me this time to talk to you. I was reflecting on my kind of schizophrenic life of the last 20 years or so. I've been at University of Washington since 99, but I've also been a farmer that whole time. And in fact, in 2006, I was offered a position to succeed Irene Vernon as the chair of comparative ethnic studies at CSU in Fort Collins. And the University of Washington said, well, we'd like you to stay. What do you want? And I said, we're on the quarter calendar at UW. I said, I want a farming quarter. And so since '07, I've been spending half my year in Seattle and half of my year in Colorado during the irrigation to harvest season. But I want to reflect on something else that I think is really important. In 1984, I got my first academic job as an assistant professor at Colorado College, classic liberal arts school. And it was in 1987, I remember, when Miguel Altieri, who's not here, I believe. It's too bad that Miguel is not here for me. He's really the founder of agroecology in the U.S. context. But his book had just come out from Westview Press. How many of you remember that 1987 version that looked like a TypeScript manuscript before they did typesetting? And in '88, I taught my first course in agroecology. But I was in the sociology department, so they wouldn't let me teach it as agroecology. They said, what is that? You got to call it. So I call it the sociology of sustainable agriculture. But it was really a course based on Miguel's beautiful book, the first edition, before it got printed again and typeset, as The Science of Sustainable Agriculture. One of the things that I'll always remember about that work was this notion that the key to resilience, a term that we use a lot, is diversity. Diversity is the key to resilience, and actually, we probably ought to give credit to Aldo Leopold for that insight, right? And he understood that diversity was good for the health of the land organism, and he also extended that to the social organism, if we want to call our dysfunctional, highly divided society that. And so one of the things that I started doing while at Colorado College was to begin challenging what we meant by diversity in terms of the sociocultural dimension. And I'll be honest with you, DEI is, in a lot of ways, a neoliberal identity trap, and we have to be very careful with it. When I think about diversity, I don't think about things like gender orientation or skin color, race, ethnicity, national origin, and all the rest. I think about epistemological diversity, epistemic diversity, and this is what I believe ought to guide us, because I know too many people with brown or black skin who think like white people. And you know what? That's not diversity. That's window dressing. Oh, we got our little minority now, we've done our job, and they think just like the white faculty. So I would challenge you, whatever you end up doing, focus not on the diversity of skin color, race, ethnicity, national, not that I don't support having that kind of diversity, but don't assume that just because you hired a Chicana, that she's going to have a subversive, contrary view of the world, that she's going to be anti-capitalist, anti-racist. That's not automatic. In fact, one of the things about the institutions of higher education, like graduate school, is that they knock that out of us. You've got to do your methodology and your review of the literature before you can even have a general exam. Who the hell decided that? Why is that the way to go? Why can we not, for example, we hear a lot about inclusion, and the whole idea of inclusivity, for me, is that, and we've heard this expressed already, that inclusion can be co-optation and erasure. You can erase me by including me. And just because you included me doesn't mean that you've done your job. For me, inclusion means that we ask the question, as the environmental justice movement asked during the first Environmental Justice Summit in 1991. The second summit was 2002. There was a saying in the environmental justice movement, we don't want an equal piece of the same rotten carcinogenic pie. And so when we talk about inclusion, it's whose table, whose house. And we've heard a lot of reference to that. I heard Deborah Echohawk talk a little bit about, you can't, or Rowan White talk about, can you really remake the master's house using the master's tools? And the answer for me is absolutely not. Now, what we need to do and focus on is, as indigenous people, BIPOC people, we need to focus on recreating our own institutions of collective action. Indigenous people and BIPOC people more generally, we already had our institutions of collective action until settler colonialism came along, took us off the land, destroyed our languages, or at least tried to destroy our languages, our whole way of being in the world. And it didn't really work because we're still here, and we're obviously, even at this conference, pushing back against that ideology of inclusivity or inclusion. I don't want to be part of an institution that's basically a key to settler colonial domination and capitalist domination, not just of this country, but of the planet. We want to build our own house using our own methods, using our own tools, using our own materials, and rather than getting invited to sit at the settler colonist table inside the master's home. So, if we're talking about knowledge power, or power knowledge, as Foucault prefers to call it, then we need to begin to build relationships, not curriculum and not a knowledge base, but relationships with those who are the true knowledge producers. And now Annie Shattuck is here, and I really love Annie. We've done some work together at Food First many years ago in a book, and that's all very important work. But when she started talking about how we need to learn from farmers in Africa and in Latin America and Asia and all the rest, she forgot to mention North America, US, Mexico, Canada. Why do you have to always go to faraway exotic places? That's the problem with the anthropologists, always looking to gawk at other people's cultures and ways of being in the world. That's not going to work anymore. You have to understand that all the agroecological knowledge that you need to know, you can learn from BIPOC communities here north of the US-Mexico border. Or if you want to include, since Mexico is part of North America, Mexico, US, and Canada are incredible sources of agroecological knowledge. So we need to stop pretending that somehow you have to go to some faraway place, maybe, I don't know, to study the water temples in Bali or the frijol tapado ecosystem in Central America. All legitimate concerns. But if you're searching for answers that will also account for the unique settler colonial history and context of this country, then you need to start collaborating, not studying, but collaborating with our BIPOC and especially our indigenous communities that have developed these agroecological systems for multiple generations. We also have to understand, and this is, I think, when we talk about transdisciplinarity, that this is part of the diversity question for me. It's not just about who is in the academic institutions, who's being admitted to grad school and so on. It's also about understanding the relationship between what I call agroecology should focus on dirt to gut. What do I mean by dirt to gut? We need to understand, like our youth in San Luis, talk about building equity. That's the only equity I'm really interested in, is the equity of building up our youth to be our successor generation. That's equity for me. It's not about equal treatment within academia. Sure, that'd be nice, but that's not going to make or break us. What's going to make or break us, and this is what we're learning with the San Luis People's Market as an actual community food cooperative, is you got to do two things to succeed. One is you got to get into this free of debt. And let me tell you, as we were getting started with our project, we've received $2.2 million already. We need about another 1.5 to finish the job. But one of the things that we kept being told early on is, well, go to the Colorado Fresh Food Finance Fund, and they'll give you a 3 to 5% interest loan. I came back, I don't know how many of you have read Christian Marazzi on the violence of financial capitalism. Has anyone read that? See, you're not transdisciplinary then. Don't pretend. How much political economy do you really know? Not much. That's what I suspect. But the transdisciplinarity for me is that we are teaching our youth, 13 to 18-year-olds, not just how to do acequia farming, but to understand soil science from the point of view of indigenous people. And I wish I could do my presentation on indigenous soil knowledge. You all know, just to give you one example, I know some of you probably know this, maybe Professor Gleisman knows this, that the Mexica, so-called Aztecs, they classified soil into 60 different varieties based on 500 years earlier on what the Soil Conservation Service used, things like the degree of organic matter, the tendency to tepetate, heart pan, infiltration rates. All of these were concepts that were familiar to the Mexica, the Colwa Mexica. And that's why they classified soil into 60 different varieties. Did you know that? Well, very few of us are aware that indigenous people have soil science. And that gets me to the other question of what do we mean by equity and diversity all joined together. And I think one of the issues is that we drew, I think, in conceptualizing the questions for this summit as almost either or. Either you're a practitioner or you're a scientist. But as Miguel Altieri told everyone, 30 plus years ago, the farmers are the first scientists. They are scientific in their approach. They do empirical observations. They do experiments. There's really not a lot of difference in terms of the methodology, but there is a lot of difference in terms of the epistemic values underlying the search for knowledge. It's not about knowing that something is, it's knowing how. Neltilitzli is the Nahua word for this concept. Knowledge is really basically knowing how, not knowing that. And too much of what we're subject to is this lack of diversity as a result of we're being told, we know that you are culturally impoverished. We know that you're slash and burn farmers. And that was a real insult to the indigenous people of Mexico, for example, when we had that whole stereotype about the mindless slash-burning peasants destroying the rainforest, when in fact, as Fedek and company made clear in their work on the Maya-managed mosaic, that the entire forests, tropical and semi-tropical forest systems of Mexico, or even the Amazon, are already anthropogenic environments. They look wild, but they're not. They've been crafted by human beings over many different generations. But, settler colonialism comes along. It doesn't fit in with their idea of what a landscape is supposed to look like if it's producing something. As Vandana Shiva and I like to say, look, when you're measuring efficiency, and I notice there's an efficiency table here, what do we mean by that? Are we only measuring the farm gate product? Or are we including all the biomass? We need to include all the biomass because some of that biomass is considered by Monsanto and conventional agriculture to be weeds. A weed is just a plant that's growing in an inconvenient place for you. And in fact, two particular weeds that I'm interested in is purslane, which we call verdolagas, and quelites, which is lamb's quarters. And both of those are considered weeds that affect agricultural productivity. But for us in the community of the Culebra watershed, the Acequia hood, as I prefer to call it, we know that purslane is a superfood. It's packed with phytochemicals that have anti-inflammatory, anti-cancer properties. And it's there as ground cover that helps to keep moisture in the ground for my milpa, my corn bean, squash, fava bean, chile polyculture. And yet most people say, oh, no, that's just a weed. How can you be eating that? And in fact, we were taught not to eat it anymore because that was poor people's food. Well, the reason it was poor people's food is not because they didn't have the money to buy at Safeway or wherever. It's because they had a tradition of knowing that that food kept them healthy. We already knew the ethnobotanical properties and the nutritional properties and the medicinal benefits of verdolagas, of quelites, quelite use, of all the different so-called wild, really what they are wild ancestors of domesticated cultivars. In my cornfields every year, you may recall George Beadle won the Nobel Prize, right, for his research on the origin of Zea mays. And Beadle, if you remember that study, he has a drawing in which he shows the native ancestor, the grassy ancestor of corn, which is teocintle. And then he has a photo of the tourniquet form. It's an intermediary between the wild teocintle and the corn as a domesticated cultivar. The teocintle and then the tourniquet, as Beadle called it, is an amazing thing because it only happens in native land-raised corn that every year in my cornfields, you'll get a tourniquet form. You'll end up with where my corn is trying to go back to being wild. It wants to go back to being teocintle. This only happens in landrace, non-GMO, and it won't even happen in hybrid corn varieties. Only in landrace varieties do you get this wanting to revert back to wildness that is a sign of the diversity of our germplasm in the acequiahood. So, and I think I'm being warned that I only have about 5 minutes left. And so I want to conclude with another set of ideas that have to do with how we build equity. And the most important kind of diversity for me is the diversity, the cultural diversity that gives birth to different ways of being a human being. And one of the things that has always touched my heart so deeply is, just to give you one example, is I do a lot of ceremony in my milpa. I pray, I dance. I have a little song that I like to sing. Vamos a sembrar, vamos a crecer, vamos a hacer semilla, buena medicina, buena medicina. And that is the key to what we're trying to build in terms of equity. We need to recreate our own institutions of collective action. And the equity that we're building up is when I've got a 17-year-old youth that tells me at a public meeting and starts explaining to someone from the NRCS about how the way we farm with corn, bean, squash, and with potatoes is we have mycorrhizal bacterial colonies. We constantly underestimate the ability for our youth to learn concepts like that. And yet, they all know now that there are nitrogen-fixing properties in our fava and our bolita beans, in our potatoes, and they really value that because it gives them a chance to understand how there's a relationship to the land, a relationship with and of the land. And for me, that's the kind of diversity we need. It's epistemological diversity. And yes, it is grounded in the cultural heritage and traditions and institutions of indigenous peoples of Turtle Island. And so I just invite you to think about diversity in this new way, or really a very old way, but new perhaps to the academics who always focus on diversity as race, class, gender, sexual orientation, all the rest, which I'm not against. That's all important. But the real diversity that I have learned is the most transformative one has to do with epistemological diversity. And I remember getting into arguments in admissions committees because someone wanted to bring in a Latino who had grown up, whose father was a banker and mother was an executive at an IT company, all the privileges, and they wanted to admit him to grad school, and I argued against that. I said, we already have plenty of wealthy Mexicanos and Latinos. I'm interested in a white male candidate who was homeless for 3 years before he finished college. He finished college while being homeless. And then there's that comment, I think it was Audre Lorde, who said, who's more powerful? The black ecofeminist English professor who's getting 6 figures a year, or the homeless white man in the alley? And everybody was, they didn't know what to answer. She said, well, context. If I leave this setting where I'm giving you a lecture and getting paid $10,000 for it, and I walk down that alley and that white male rapes me, the power relationship has changed. So we need to understand the importance of context. We need to understand the importance of settler colonial institutions have not disappeared. You know the saying, settler colonialism is not an event, it's a structure. It's a structure of domination, and the key to that structure of domination is to erase indigenous people. And not just indigenous people as bodies, but indigenous people's knowledge. And I can just see it's already happening, and a lot of people have warned us about this, the culture vulture syndrome, where, the crystal therapist comes, interviews a couple of indigenous persons, and all of a sudden they're a shaman. No. The same thing happens with academics. You don't become an indigenous farmer by interviewing a handful of us for your dissertation. That's not how it works. So we need to recall that overall, This is an ethical question, and it's a question of power-knowledge relations, and that if we're interested in doing diversity, equity, inclusion, we need to get away from identity politics as it is understood and masterminded by the dominant institutions. And finally, I would also remind everyone, we didn't invent identity politics. It was invented when this republic of property, it's not a democracy, it's a republic of property, was created where only white men who were property owners were enfranchised. That's the original identity politics. And if everyone is going to be complaining about wokeism and all that, you know what? You only have yourself to blame, because you created a republic of property that by definition excluded 90% of us. So, bueno, ahí vamos. Gracias.
Hello, everybody. Hard to follow, but I just wanted to say first, I'm just really humbled to not only be invited to this conference, but to be able to have a microphone. And so I've been really humbled to learn from so many people in this room already about what agroecology is to them. And so I'm currently dismantling my own ideas about it as I'm here. So I think first, what I wanted to acknowledge is the diversity of ideas, causes, and issues that have brought us all to agroecology. And as I think it was Alexis mentioned yesterday at dinner, some of us have come with questions of wonder and curiosity. And for me, as an ecologist, it was about wonder and curiosity about how food can grow. It's miraculous. And learning about questions of worry and concern about how to survive and about who gets to survive, truly. And so I think this convergence of curiosity and concern is what gives agroecology its power and its relevancy today. But of course, that this can also be a cause of fracture and some misunderstanding within our own movement, practice, our science. And so I just wanted to make 2 points. The first being, I think we can all agree that diversity is a central component of agroecology, whether that's ecological diversity or social. And then we must also get to the point of acknowledging that fostering diversity means confronting these power systems. And so as an ecologist by training, I know that biological diversity tends to promote life, stability, abundance, well-being, and the lack of diversity can lead to homogeneity, vulnerability, malfunction, and collapse. And we've learned from the past when it came to the environment that humans, especially settler colonizers, have done a lot of destruction. And there's a journalist in the 80s who wrote a really interesting question that was, are we going to be the asteroids or the dinosaurs in our own extinction story? And that's something I think about a lot, because why I wanted to be an agroecologist is I wanted to do neither of those. I don't want to be a victim and I don't want to be a villain. And I think what we've just heard is helping us reflect on this relationship with power as a scientist in agroecology. Am I using my power to take up too much space? How do we need to reorganize our idea of who gets to make our food systems? And so this question has brought me to consider my own relationship with power. And in our breakout group conversation today, I think it was Carmen who mentioned how white people need to talk about dismantling white power in order for plural societies to emerge. And I think that is really important to acknowledge. And in that analogy is, are we the asteroid in this system? And what do we need to do to change course? I think the second point I wanted to make is just this means that shifting for a lot of us who've identified with the scientific part of agroecology, we need to shift away from only asking how should we farm, but this question of who gets to farm, who gets access to land, and whose ideas are going to shape our landscapes. And so there's a lot of ways that we can try to look for transformative policies, right, that that can be allocated to practitioners and communities who've been historically marginalized. And that may be through reparations, as we discussed in our breakout session. It could be seed grants with no strings or timelines attached. It could also be by absorbing risk for farmers, by allowing them to experiment and also having a backup if it doesn't go well. And lastly, I just think in order to break down this kind of partition within the practice science movement idea and to be more unified, I think we need to acknowledge and value that experience and evidence are both forms of data. And I think that it's really hard for maybe a basic scientist to acknowledge, but I think that is a really big step moving forward. And that gets at our idea of honoring our divergence and celebrating convergence. And Robin Wall-Kimmerer has a very helpful analogy for that of holding scientific Western knowledge and holding traditional ecological knowledge or indigenous knowledge as two lenses, as glasses, so that you can see through both, and that they are both important and they do overlap, but they're also distinct. And so lastly, as mentioned earlier, I think it's important to mention that inclusion can be violent. It has been said that inviting voices into spaces that are not built for them or undermine their messages, lived experiences, and expertise can work against the goals of inclusion. And so I think it's time in this space, it's really exciting that we can reimagine what sort of space is this, even this conference going to be, whose voices will be heard. And I think that means examining our own relationships to power and being willing to give up space when we need to and take up space here. So that's all I have. Thank you.
Okay, I'm one of the tall people, so move this. So thank you, everybody, for being here, and thank you, Devin, for stepping in very last minute to provide these comments. I might end up repeating some of the things that have been said. I did write up a sort of 2-page document and had a planned uncharacteristically to actually just read a document, which I don't normally do, but all that's going out the window in terms of, responding to what is, right? And that's one of the things that we have to do if we care about DEI, which I hate that term, but if we care about diversity and equity inclusion as actual values, one of the things is being open to what we don't expect. So I helped organize this panel, and I had 4 different people who were going to be here and were going to be on this panel who could not make it at the last minute for various kinds of reasons, right? One of them is our colleague Neher from the Farm Workers Association of Florida, who is facing new anti-migrant legislation that his organization has to rapidly respond to and mobilize around supporting their members, right? And these are the things that people who are diverse, quote unquote, meaning not part of established systems and structures, not privileged in various ways, this is what they have to deal with all the time, right? So if you're an organizer of an event and you invite people to diversify your event and they cannot make it at the last minute, right? That's on you to be humble enough and understand that it is not a personal affront. It is not a failing of that person, right? And these are the kinds of flexibilities, I think, or just attentiveness that we need to bring, right? Or also, as an organizer of an event, and I do feel like my role on the organizing committee has largely been about bringing not the idea of diversity, but the fact of it, right? Trying to bring people who represent not just because of their skin color, but because of their actual work, because of their actual values, because of who they are accountable to into this space, so that we do have a conversation that moves beyond what many fear, which would be a very depoliticized agronomic vision for agroecology. And so I know there might still be some failings. And at an earlier conversation with Devin at the table, I felt that sense of, but I'm trying my best to do this, as a person who definitely looks white, comes from a mixed ethnic heritage, a very confused cultural heritage, I will say. I have to be one of these people to reconnect to a land base and reconnect to any sort of ancestral knowledge, because I wasn't really provided that through my upbringing, through my connections, through family. But the point is to not be defensive, right? So if you're in one of these positions to do this work, you have to do it in a way that is always trying to do your best and recognizing that two things can be true at once, right? That we try to create a system here that is participatory, that has an open-ended outcome, that includes these diverse voices in order to make that outcome as strong as it can be, as impactful and meaningful as it can be, and that we haven't done enough, and that a system where we try to get you to answer certain questions and those questions have a lot of assumptions in it is still colonial in some ways, right? To recognize that these things can coexist is one thing that's important. So I will, those are my offhanded remarks, I guess. I wanted to say that what I had written was explicitly sort of focused on this question of research and what is the role of research in DEI, right? So if I had thought about it at a much broader level, I would have very different things to say, I think, in terms of DEI in society and how do we change out of the current existing system? How do we essentially go outside empire, as the name of our new sort of working group is? So I'm going to speak more narrowly now to research. And of course, there's different ways that DEI can be brought into research. I mean, ideally, DEI can elevate awareness of historical marginalization and existing injustices along the lines of various kinds of group identities. It can make career paths easier for quote unquote diverse individuals to navigate, including diverse individuals who actually have different epistemologies, as was mentioned. And it can shape research agendas in useful ways. So I think if done well, DEI can improve the rigor, the reach, and the relevance of research. But I don't think this is necessarily the standard practice in research at large. And I think, unfortunately, it's not even the standard practice in agroecological research. But the three things that I would say could sort of generally speaking can do to influence research on agroecology is to change the status quo of research funding, and that really entails a change among the activities and the behaviors of funders. Secondly, of course, research practice, how researchers research, and as mentioned, I'm a member of and a co-organizer of the Agroecology Research Action Collaborative, or Collective, and we're a group of researchers throughout North America seeking to basically do research alongside various kinds of community groups and social movements. And we created, unfortunately, our website is down, but because we're an unincorporated, non-formal group, right? So we don't have funds, but we have these things, the principles and protocols, and you can find them if you search on the Internet Archive for our website. But basically, we created a system of principles and protocols around ethical partnership-based research to inform our activities as individuals and as a collective. And subsequently, those same principles have been used by grassroots groups through our encounters with the U.S. Food Sovereignty Alliance and other partners. They've turned that into ways that they deny research access to researchers who do not maintain an ethical standard, right? So we made them for ourselves, to hold ourselves to a system and to be accountable. But we can see how having principles and protocols as researchers can actually aid the different kinds of communities that diversify agroecology to maintain data sovereignty, right? To maintain ownership over their own experience, and also to actually be resourced in the process of research, right? And then the third thing, I guess, related to that needs to be thought about for researchers is, of course, deeper relationships and dialogue with and among constituencies that are relevant to DEI. And that goes against the sort of individualistic approach, the neoliberal approach that Devin was talking about, which I think is way too common. And in contrast, right, we need to think about deeper reckoning with past injustices and how these ramify in the present, including, for example, the many of us who might be associated with land-grant universities, right, and their foundation on the thefts of indigenous land. So our jobs are tied to that theft, and it's not just a sort of guilt-related thing. It's an active process of figuring out how do we use that position best, right? It's not, there's no clear answers, but you have to be interested in that process and be able to talk to people about it. And talking, of course, involves trust, and that's why relationships are key. And I'll say this gets back to the question of funders, and it's been mentioned a couple times, but there are things that are happening in the realm of funding in some of the more progressive philanthropies to start doing long-term kinds of funding, no strings attached, no having to file ridiculous reports. So just to be clear, I don't think we're ever going to get USDA to do that. But I think that having a standard and saying, if you are going to be philanthrocapitalists, or if you're going to take stolen land and turn it into a new paradigm of industrial agriculture and then give out a bunch of funding and a little bit is going to go to DEI concerns, we can say, well, this is how funding can actually support DEI, is by funding relationships and long-term strategies to build relationships among communities, regardless of researchers, and between communities and researchers, or, as we need to recognize, communities that are also researchers, and researchers that come from various communities. So there's all these ways that I think we need to influence how research gets funded. And also things like the RFP processes and who's involved in creating RFPs and who's involved in reviewing them. All of these things deserve critical scrutiny if we're going to be attentive to these kinds of things. I also think that we need to think about the role of researchers in studying up. I happen to be someone who studies mostly social movement type behaviors because that's where I come from personally and what I'm interested in. But I recognize the very important task of recognizing what is going on in places of power and how those impact diverse communities, right? And are essentially the basis for inequality. So that includes us studying our own institutions, right? And calling out the places we work, the places we engage with, to the extent that they're complicit in these processes. And I know that's not easy, but I think that taking those risks as people of relative privilege, right? It's not just about black and white levels of privilege. We have relative privilege, but that's an important thing throughout history that has been a motion for change, has been people willing to take risks, right? People who are working to defend their lands from continued colonization are taking those risks all the time, right? If you have a more cush job, it behooves you to also take some of those risks. So I think I don't really have a conclusion. One last thing is that I think this combination of social and natural sciences, we need to, I'm not into necessarily transdisciplinarity, but at least not allowing natural sciences to present themselves as apolitical and sort of the standard body of knowledge, and that when you talk about power or inequality or things that are divisive or political, that all of a sudden you're not scientific, right? We need to own that. We need to overcome the fears of politics and of normative science, and to boldly refuse to be neutral on a moving train. All right, that's it.